Hi, guys.
Hi. This is not our normal setup
Not at
because we
all.
have a very special guest today.
We do, and we're so excited to have him.
We could not be more excited. So, this man's plight is very near and dear to our hearts. We have so much empathy for his life experience and also are so incredibly inspired by his resilience and his mindset and what he's made of his circumstances. So today we're going to talk to Franky Carrillo.
Franky.
Franky. Franky was featured on the Netflix documentary series, The Innocence Files. He, long story short, we will get into everything, was wrongfully convicted in 1992. He spent 20 years incarcerated before he was finally exonerated and released. And Franky has made it a point to remain an advocate for people who are still struggling in the system. And he wants to make change. He's a change maker. Franky is a member of the LA County Probation Commission. He's also the senior policy advisor for the Los Angeles Innocence Project. So he has stayed close to the community of people who were wrongfully convicted. He is fighting for their release and contributing his time and efforts to help people. He knows what it feels like to be in that position, and he really gives a shit.
He does.
He really does, and he has a huge heart. And right now, he's running for the California State Assembly for the 52nd District. So he has truly made it his life's mission to give back to the community, to share everything he's learned from his life experience, to inspire other people and tell them that there are no limits to what they can do in this lifetime. And that inspires me.
Yeah. He's also a dad. He's an investor. He probably has a bunch of business ventures that we don't even know about. He does everything. Franky,
he's a multi-hyphenate.
Yeah. But more than anything, he's a real fighter. And, you know, I'm so excited to have this conversation with him because what I know of him is nothing short of just remarkable. So I'm so excited for you guys to get to know him and for us to just chop it up here and share some life together.
Yes. What an honor.
Truly.
Okay.
All right.
Well, here you go.
Here we go.
Franky Carrillo. Let's get it. Franky freaking Carrillo.
Hey.
Yeah.
I'm on your couch, by the way.
I know.
What is this thing?
You're on the portion of my couch that I turned into a chair.
I like it.
It is an honor that you are here. And I wouldn't have expected that we would have, gotten together to do something like this. I mean, we met pretty recently, but obviously we have such shared passions, and both of us have so much respect for everything you've gone through, and then what you've made of it is so impressive. Your story started when you were really young. You experienced a wrongful conviction, spent way too many years incarcerated as a result of that. And it started from a young age for you. So I feel like, I want to get an idea of kind of what life was like for you leading up to that, your childhood. What was the environment like, and what was your perception on life at that time as a young person?
My mom and dad arrived here to Los Angeles in the early 60s. And my mother and father eventually had 4 children. I'm the third of 4. And my mom and dad, both Mexican, really struggled to assimilate to this country. Then eventually the entire family would go back to TJ where their family was still. So it's very close. And so they never really let go of the past and really establish roots in the U.S. And I think that confusion for the children is something I've been thinking about lately, and how that has sort of played a major role in my life. And so I was born in 1974, so I'm 50 years old.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's very monumental to be 50 for some bizarre reason, right?
It's an accomplishment.
It really is. It really is. I was born in General Hospital here in Los Angeles, and I was raised in a small town by the name of Linwood. Linwood is sort of nestled in between Compton, Watts, Southgate, Downey. And I always think about Linwood growing up as like this identity crisis city. It's really a city. To the east was Downey, a very predominant white city. And to the west of it was Watson Compton, which had more of an African American, population. And Linwood was kind of like, where do you lean, right? Are you like more towards the black side or the white side? And as a boy, I experienced white flight. It was a really eclectic neighborhood. Everyone was there, basically. And at some point, the white families just started leaving. And I think from what I hear now, they left because factories are shutting down, like the big factories like Chevy and Firestone, good paying jobs were just leaving. And so they kind of followed the companies to Nebraska or whatever, right? This is now like in the early 80s, mid 80s. And raising a family in that environment became very difficult for my parents. So very gang infested. Although I wasn't a drug user, there was a lot of drugs around town. People that I knew were using drugs. I'm a teenage father. There used to be a little bit of like, don't even talk about that. Being a 6-year-old boy who had been, having unprotected sex with my then girlfriend. And the idea wasn't to get her pregnant or sort of have your life, turned upside down because now
Rarely
this
are
huge
you planning that far in the future at that age.
No one is doing that, right? And, life happens and I'm grateful we got to set out of it. But yeah, the city was interesting.
Yeah.
LA was interesting.
But you weren't an adolescent that was kind of like running amok.
I think everyone in that neighborhood was sort of running amok.
Yeah.
I think being a teenager, you're kind of testing boundaries. You're doing things maybe you shouldn't be doing.
You're doing normal teenage shit though, honestly. To a certain extent.
Exactly.
To a certain extent, that's what it comes down to is it's labeled as you're running amok, but to be honest, so many kids
teenagers
that age
are testing boundaries.
Yeah, they're trying out
learning.
life and seeing what feels right and seeing what this all looks like. So
that's exactly it. I think now, like in perspective, like, as a 50-year-old man, I'm thinking, when I was a kid, shouldn't have been doing that, or, wish someone would have said, hey, Frankie, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's that adolescence part of your life where like as you're saying, right, you're kind of pushing the envelope or you're finding your own identity, you're making new friends. So all that was kind of coming to play in my life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess that leads us to the really big life event that changed everything for you.
Yeah, you know what? I was before the big event, right?
Let's go.
My mom and dad divorced, and I was in 3rd grade. And regardless of the complexities, like marriage failed, the impact of the kids was definitely felt. Right? And so it is what it is, right? But in my case, what's unique is that I think in most families, the dad splits. The dad just decides like, I'm gone. The mother typically stays with the children. In my case, my dad became the sole provider and my mom left the house. So the uniqueness of that was interesting for like coming of age, right? So like, where's your mom?
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. And, I'm sure that was some mocking, people were maybe laughing at us or whatever, or like, it just became a thing. No mother in this household. The life went on obviously after that. And I saw my mom years later, but not being raised by a mother, especially at a very young age of 9, there's some carryover, right? There's some, you hear like the, daddy issues, but the mother issue is one that also comes to mind, right? Like, why not? But I think the nurturing part that a mother can only provide when those, I don't know, fundamentals are sort of not there, it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah, it hurts,
Definitely.
Yeah.
9 to 14, from my understanding, is such a critical time in an adolescent's life, adolescent boys particularly, and just having that proper guidance kind of from your caretakers. And so that timeline, I think just anytime, the absence of presence is felt, but I feel like that's such a critical time for young people to feel properly guided,
Now that I'm a dad, so I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old,
Okay.
and thinking about like the responsibilities of establishing the lessons now, the communication, the structure, so that when those 9 to 14 or 14 to 17 or 18 or like life, right?
Yeah.
That there's those fundamental sort of values and connections and bonds are in place.
Absolutely.
So that as the parent, you see your child blossom in ways that you expect them to. But also if they're either peer pressured or being, misguided, there's the bond of a parent that can always kind of hone you back in and say, hey, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Versus someone else doing that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to get to the large event. My one question prior to that was, did you have any experience with the juvenile justice system before this happened?
I did. So back in that time, a lot of crime was happening that time in LA.
Yeah.
The drug epidemic, like heavy gang violence, that was like a thing that was very prevalent. As a young boy, most of my friends either had been pulled over, had been cuffed, had been in the back of a police car, juvenile hall overnight, some basic stuff, some basic interaction with law enforcement. And
Yeah.
that was definitely me too. I was definitely part of an environment where law enforcement, especially in Linwood at the time, there was a deputy gang called the Linwood Vikings who unfortunately, my introduction to law enforcement as a young boy amongst just the neighbors was like, look, if something happens, tell your mom, tell your dad, tell yourself, whoever, don't call the cops.
Yeah.
Because they're only going to make matters worse.
Yeah.
And then you hear, why, and then you kind of start watching them perform their bad acts, and you realize like, shit, I'm living in a world where, teachers are telling you, if you're ever in an emergency or if you ever need help, call the fire department or call the cops. And then in the sort of outside of school in real life, you see cops beating up your friends.
Yeah.
Or doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. So not all cops, obviously, but there was a dynamic there that was really unfortunate.
Yeah. And that was understood.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, that is something that comes with power that can be really hard to stamp out. And we'll get into you getting into politics later, but that's part of the reason why I'm so excited that you're getting into politics, because we need you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So fairly innocent interactions with law enforcement up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
And then...
So my dad at some point said, you know what, enough's enough. This environment's just a little too hectic for himself and the family. And so my father, myself, and my little brother moved from Linwood to Maywood, which it wasn't a big leap, but it was definitely still a change.
Yeah.
And so when we moved, the idea was that it was going to be a new start. And it was. I was going to high school. Things are different. And as much as I thought that our lives had taken a new path of maybe some peace for once, it all changed.
Yeah.
And so the story is unfortunate. There was a man who was murdered, Donald Sarpy. He was a victim in a drive-by shooting. And that family was tragically affected forever and ever, right?
As they would be.
And the sad part about it was that pain had been compounded when a rush to judgment caused the cops to arrest the wrong person, which was me. And so not only was his family, the Sarpy family, impacted, now the Carrillo family had been impacted unjustly as well.
Definitely.
So here's this innocent bystander who was murdered. And I get that. You want to solve a case. You want to get to the bottom of it. But to my point, as you'll learn from my story, not only was it the wrong person they arrested, but sort of what happened next was really unfortunate.
Right.
So I was now 16 years old. I was a 10th grader in high school. And on January 24th, 1991, I was rudely awakened by the sheriff's department, and they were there to arrest me. I was taken back to the sheriff's station, and I was, booked. I was, I guess, offered or read my Miranda rights, and I agreed to talk. I had nothing to hide. And their big question was, where was I on January 18th? And, for a 16-year-old boy, 6 days prior, it was really easy for me to recall where I was. So I told them exactly where I was at. And they said, no, you weren't. We have a witness that says exactly where you were. You were involved in the drive-by shooting, and we got you. Basically, confess now, kind of give up, right?
Right.
And I'm like, it's sort of weird, but you're in this very surreal environment where these homicide detectives really are not really questioning you, but they're really just kind of just saying, like, let's just stop bullshitting, basically.
Yes.
We have you, you're under arrest, just admit. And on my end, I'm thinking, shit, how mistaken can you be?
Yeah.
I'm telling you, you got the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, we don't. We got you. And it's just like, what like your brain stops working at that point.
Yes. No, that makes so much sense. Did you believe that they were going to get it right?
I did. And I think for me at least, it really was stemming from being naive.
Yeah.
As a kid, as an observer, you're thinking, wow, this is where I think enough of a courthouse to think whatever's going to happen here is going to be just, it's going to be fair. We're here to get to the bottom of it. And so that very simple way of thinking about it was kind of like all I had.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, this will get figured out. It's sort of funny, right?
No, it's because it's so understandable.
I think most people would think that, even if it's just because they're desperately hoping that that's the case.
I mean, listen, being justice impacted myself, my family, I guess, it's still hard for me to believe that it happens. When I hear about cases and I understand that this has happened in the last couple of years, it still is difficult for my brain to process that something so tragic and wrong can happen to somebody. And just the thought of how many people are sitting in prison for things that they didn't do right now, it's very overwhelming for me. I can't even imagine how overwhelming it is for you. But
I think
anyways.
It's also scary for people to hear about because it requires responsibility and accountability on the part of systems that aren't operating the way that they should, and that such egregious mistakes like this can be made, and they cost people their lives, they cost people years and years and years of their lives or worse. And I think that's why we want to keep having these conversations, is because we want to keep putting humanity on display and sharing with people a normal life that you were living, and, normal life obstacles. And then something so drastic can happen and so far out of your control, seemingly. But trial in and of itself is so traumatizing and so intense. But you had 2 trials, right?
I did. So let me just go one step back. So,
Please.
16 years old. I've been accused of killing Donald Sarpy, a man who's, I learned he was a father, a community member, a great husband. And then here I am, the 6-year-old boy who is at the defense table being accused of that, right? So because the crime was so, not only was it violent, someone was murdered, they have an option to try you as an adult or not.
Yeah.
So it's either like the path of a juvenile or the path of an adult. And it's really less about how they try you. It's more about how they're going to punish you. I think people think about that a little. I'm always surprised that they don't connect that dot. And so if they try you as a juvenile, your punishment, not that it's overly minimal, but they can only hold your body until your 25th birthday. And so at that point, now it'll be 9 years, a max of 9 years if they're going to go down the path of trying me as a juvenile versus try me as an adult, and they can hold my body for the rest of their lives, or my life, obviously.
Right.
6 lifetimes.
Exactly.
As many lifetimes as they want to pin on you.
The sentence at that point, was up in the air. What followed was as we were pointing out, the jury trials. And for that 6-year-old boy, like looking back now, when they said we're going to try you as an adult, I actually was sort of excited about that.
Why?
I wasn't thinking about the punishment. I mean, of course, you're 16. You're not thinking what they're kind of there for.
Yeah.
I was thinking, well, if they try me as an adult, there's like a higher standard.
Oh.
The standard would be that
you thought they would be more thorough and everything.
Yeah, but the Compton court sort of encompasses that area. So I'm in Compton, and I'm housed in Eastlake Juvenile Hall, and so I'm kind of back and forth. And my reality was that regardless of how long it's going to take, what's happening in my sort of day-to-day life, they're going to get to the bottom of it.
Right.
That's all I had. It was my only card.
Yeah.
Was that the adults in the room would do the right thing. They'll realize that these witnesses or the cops were overzealous and they lied or they made a mistake. And I was really focusing on mistake because in my case, it was about a 15-year-old boy saying that I was the person who did it. And so I was viewing that, even again, being naive, thinking, well, he was just mistaken.
Right.
He made a mistake, so they'll figure that out.
Yeah.
Versus, as we found out later on, that there was more than just that.
Can you go into briefly for people to understand exactly what was happening, like what evidence they were trying to hold against you? So somebody had passed away in a drive-by shooting, and there were witnesses to that, essentially. So can you explain a little bit about what they were trying to present, what case they were trying to present?
Yeah, so there were 6 boys. As far as we know, there were 6 boys that were out in front of a house. And these were the people that the guys were shooting towards or shooting at.
Oh.
Missed them, shot the father.
Oh.
And so these boys...
Was it one of their dads?
It was, yeah. So Damien was the son of Donald, the victim. And so the boys became victim/eyewitnesses.
Right.
What's interesting about this case is that the first round of investigation of just kind of like, hey, what do you remember on the spot? one guy said the car was white, one said the car was black, one guy said it was two-tone. So like they couldn't even figure out the biggest sort of object here, the vehicle. That was, no one was able to be in agreement about even the color. So it's obviously at nighttime, and it moved into, well, now tell me who did it.
Right.
And they were saying like didn't see the shooter. And so then at that point, it's basically a cold case, right? You don't have a lead on who did it. You can't even figure out the color of the car. You can't even determine how many shots were fired. You know, it's a unexpected shooting. You're probably not even worried about the car. You're probably just talking with your friends and so on. And then that happens, right?
And someone's driving by, so it's clearly a brief interaction.
And then I think that the reality is, I mean, like, look, I think about, even if it's a firecracker, you know, you hear or you know it's a gun, you're gonna duck. You're gonna dodge. You're not gonna like look back and say, oh, okay, yeah, the guy had green eyes or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, you're too worried about saving your life, right?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what the first round of interviews kind of went. Second round, a little bit more of the same. And then thirdly, it turns out that I guess one of the cops determined or realized that one of the boys who was there that night had been a confidential informant. And they tracked down the cop, the deputy, who was like his lead person. And so they brought that person in. And once they had...
I'm sitting forward.
Yeah. So
What?
once they had the cop who was partnered up or assigned to this confidential informant, this 15-year-old boy, then the case unraveled.
So he had informed on other cases before. Wow.
Yeah. So randomly, this boy, he's a victim. So he's sort of part of this case. There's no way around that. And so they determined that they should get Deputy Ditch involved. And so they probably wake him up and they bring him in. And all of a sudden, the boy who on the first two times said he knew nothing is now saying that Franky did it.
Okay, so how did your name get looped in? Just random eeny, meeny, miny, mo? Or did you ever end up finding out?
So we never really found out.
Okay.
But what we know is that there was a picture used, there was a photo lineup that was part of like the Exhibit A, right?
Okay.
And there was a picture of me there in picture number, I think it was picture number 1. And the photograph that was used in that photo lineup was taken during a random day in my life, maybe 2 years prior to that specific night, where a cop would just sort of pulled me and my buddies over on our bicycles and was just like, hey guys, what are you doing? Hey, do you have a girlfriend? Ha ha ha. You know, what school do you go to? Oh, I've seen you around. Just random, just talking to a cop, right? Then the guy says, do you mind if I take your photograph? And this is maybe 1990, 89, 90. And so back then it was a Polaroid camera. So, you know, I might have been, I don't know, whatever, 14 years old. And I just said, like, I guess, like, what are you going to say no to the cop, right?
Yeah.
And so he got out of his car, photographed us kind of where we were standing. And that photograph that was taken of me on that random day was used in this photo lineup.
Wow.
And so more to the theory or to the why, I don't know.
Okay.
You know, my attorneys have tried to sort of, you know, untangle that.
Piece it together.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know what scares me is that the cop can arrest you.
Right.
And they present the charges to the DA's office and they say, okay, we'll prosecute. But after that, like the conveyor belt is supposed to be sterile. But the fact that they sort of like jumped on that conveyor belt with me, the cops, to make sure they got the outcome they wanted, is what scares me.
Yes.
Because not only did they falsify the evidence up front, they went to court and testified. They drove the witnesses to the courthouse.
They drove the witnesses personally to the courthouse?
Yeah. So this was, and it turns out I wasn't the only one. They had done this to other folks as well. But they were doing...
Unsurprising.
Yeah, they were kind of going beyond the call of duty here on these cases, where they wanted to make sure that the outcome they wanted is what they got.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So originally there was one of the witnesses who ended up identifying you, and he had a prior, you know, working relationship with this specific officer where he identified you. And then it spread to the other people who were there, essentially.
Yeah. So, and I'm kind of giving you sort of what I know now about the case. So
right.
It turns out that this boy Scotty went back and tainted everyone's, basically their memory. Or maybe they didn't taint it. He just influenced their narrative, right?
Right.
So he basically said, if they ever ask you what photograph to select, pick number 1. And so kind of random kind of piece of advice, right? So sure enough, the DA realized that if there was going to be a prosecution, she needed more than just one witness. And so she went back and tracked down the other 5 boys who were still, living in the area. And sure enough, as Scotty said, if they ever show you photographs, pick number 1. And so they all picked photograph number 1.
Wow.
And so it seemed like, looking back, like these cases seem to be like, come on.
Right.
It's been, at this point now, it's been about 8 months after the crime. They're showing you photographs and you're like all of a sudden recalling a face that on the night of, you had no recollection, you had no clues, you had zero.
Right.
But 8 months later, you have, oh my God, clear recollection that not only who did it, but that I was the one who did it.
Right. We've spoken a little bit about eyewitness identification before on the podcast and how unreliable it is. And also at the same time, how impactful eyewitness testimony still seems to be on juries, regardless of how much we know that it is very unreliable. And so I can only imagine for you, like having this many kids identifying you all of a sudden. First of all, I can imagine how terrifying and confusing that was for you to say, well, how the hell could this many people be identifying me when I did not do this?
It's nuts. So I, it's crazy because, it's the first sort of wave of that is like interrogation, right? The cops are saying it seems very professional. It seems they're telling you something, they're scaring you and so on. But when you're in court and you see these boys your age coming in and saying these things, they're lying.
Yeah.
But you don't know why they're lying. You don't, again, I'm still thinking, I'm very optimistic. I'm very forgiving. I'm thinking, oh, they're just confusing me with somebody else, right? And so there was a moment where I realized, okay, this is all over. The moment I've been waiting for has arrived. And the star witness is on the stand. And my attorney, to his credit, starts saying things like, well, tell me how sure you are that Franky did it. I've heard you say that he drove by and all that stuff, right? But how do you know Franky? You're talking as if you know this guy. And he says, yeah, me and Franky, I know who the guy is. Oh, how? He's like, well, we go to school together. Oh, you guys go to school? Tell me more, right? And so I'm at the defense table, live performance, right? And I'm like, never seen this dude in my life.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, we're in class together. We have whatever, math class together, 4th period, whatever. And he's like, well, oh, you do? What school is that? Linwood High School. Oh, cool. Okay. So then what? Give me some more stories about Franky, right? And he's like, well, I saw Franky get his ass kicked. Oh, you did? Tell me more. Where? In school? Outside? Right outside of school. He was on his way home and my friend Aaron kicked his ass. Oh, then what happened? So here's this dude.
Now this whole narrative.
Did you even go to Linwood High?
0.
I was just about to say, didn't you move out of Linwood?
Exactly.
Boom.
So I never attended Linwood High School. So this boy is like,
it's not funny.
It's not funny. It's not funny.
But it is funny,
we can
right?
laugh about it now.
It's so
depressing is what it is, but
it's depressing, but it's also, I thought it was going to be the moment.
Yeah.
Dude, just whatever you're saying, just keep saying it, right?
Yeah.
And so he says, Aaron kicked his ass. So then what? So he's like, well, Franky was on the ground and my friend was, those people around and I was an observer, big fight outside the school. And he said, I witnessed my friend tear Franky's shirt off and it exposed his big tattoo that he had on his chest. And
wow,
I'm like,
this is a detailed lie.
Oh my God.
Pull up your shirt.
Well, I'm thinking, God damn, dude. One, we're in the same classroom. That's a lie. 2, this high school that you're saying all this happened, I've never attended. So when I'm like, this is over. Oh my God, just Judge, give me a minute here to explain, right? But third of all, the guy is now saying I have a tattoo. I don't have a single tattoo on my body. And I was thinking, okay, this is, any second now they're going to say just Franky, just get the hell out of here, right?
Right.
It's not what happened. So how I wish it would have been played out was he would have came over to me and said, Franky, do you have a tattoo? And I would have said, I don't. And although it might have been a little funny or a little bit humiliating for me, what he should have done was Franky, do you mind standing up right now and taking your shirt off?
Yeah.
And showing the jury this so-called tattoo. But he didn't do that.
Did he bring in your school records to show where you went to school or anything like that?
He did. Yeah, he did. So that initial trial, the first trial, was a hung jury.
Okay.
Okay,
And so
that was the mistrial. Right
yeah. So, I mean, it should have been it, right? It should have been, okay, like,
Yes.
look, the witnesses are saying some random ass shit.
Yes.
They're just kind of just making stuff up as they go along.
It's
But to their
beyond
credit,
enough reasonable doubt.
oh my God, right? But you're thinking, I mean, I was thinking, okay, cool. This has played itself out. It's now been determined that this is not the way the cops made it sound. And so the DA should have like dropped the case there, but she didn't.
Wow.
So soon after I was retried, and it was a rehearsal basically. So now they have a chance to go back on the stand. And this time, not a single thing about the school. There was no tattoo mentioned. It was a joke, you know? It really was a joke.
All right. So walk us through your mental/emotional state when you go through 2 trials as a child and end up getting convicted of first-degree murder and 6 attempted murders. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the sentence that you had is so serious. Like how can you even process all of that as a kid?
Yeah. You know, what was tough about that part of the story was that on my 18th birthday, by policy, they transferred me from the local juvenile hall over to the men's central jail adult side, basically. And I tell folks, I went from like milking cookies in the juvenile hall, awaiting my life to kind of get reestablished and me getting out, to being transferred over and like really being like in the worst situation that I've ever been in my life.
So I've heard from multiple people that have done hard time in the SHU, in here, there, everywhere, that Men's Central downtown is the hardest time you could do.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
I have heard that from people who have done level 4 max security, hardest of hard time.
Yeah. No, it's the real deal. Not only is it the worst, even for me, like, so I'm going to add my name to that list of being the worst
Franky
ever.
Carrillo?
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Added
I mean,
to that
LA
list?
County Jail, right?
Yep.
But what's unfortunate is that it's a mixed bag, right? So it's like folks who've been in prison, so they're back, they're, you know, potentially going back, whatever. But the conditions are so horrific. And that's what gets you. And then what's bad about it, I guess it's sort of by design, they want your conditions to be so bad that you just want to like take that deal. You want to just like cave. You want to just like get it over with. And so the jail is almost like working, you know, I guess in cahoots with the court.
Yes.
Right? But the psychological, so I'll go back to that part about the psychological impact.
Yeah. How old were you when you were convicted on that second trial? Were
18
you 8
years old.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you were
I just
18.
turned.
So you had been in Men's Central and you went to court from Men's Central and got convicted. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that the court dynamic after being convicted, you know, not only was it painful, but it was very confusing on how to talk about it to my family.
Yeah.
How to talk about it to the guys who were around me. Like, you know, you're still in jail. There's friends you create and people you talk to. And, you know, I was being very optimistic that this would be over. And then it wasn't.
Yeah.
And you're like, shit, what do I say now? You know?
So
And
juvenile hall
yeah.
for you was an experience that, like, looking back, was it just in contrast to adult jail and Men's Central, or did you have an okay experience? I mean, that's such a weird question because I guess we're just kind of getting to youth incarceration and kind of what that looked like for you.
Look, comparing the jail to anything is unfair because the jail it's the worst of the worst,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
But I think I had some horrific experiences in the juvenile hall. Like, a probation officer tried to kill me.
Wow.
So I think of like, in the midst of all that's going on, like here I am, a kid who's just like got engulfed in this terrible situation. But in the midst of all that, there was a probation officer who like literally tried to kill me. And nothing came of it. But I will say that even though that's like a terrible experience, that environment was one where I still found hope.
Okay.
The staff were still humanizing me at that point. They were still seeing me. The case was still pending. I would share with them, you know, the circumstances of my case. But as obviously as you can imagine, you know, going over to the men's side, the adult side, you're just a number. So
yeah, I was going to say, do you think that some of the hopefulness while you were incarcerated as a youth had to do with the fact that you hadn't seen an outcome on your case yet? Or do you think it was actually the environment of the juvenile hall that was, you know, lending to that?
Yeah, good question. I think the optimism came from within me.
Yeah.
I think I was just like,
That's what I hear.
yeah.
I hear that you were eternally optimistic as a child. Like you didn't know what you were walking into. And for you, you processed that experience as the right thing will unfold. And I'm going to walk through this experience and find camaraderie in my peers as I walk through this experience while it's getting worked out. But then transitioning over to the adult side of things, that shit hits you, you know what I mean? And it hits you fast and hard and you realize, oh, wow, you know, what the outcome of this trial may be. Also, I hope that I'm just saying what I'm hearing from you. Like, it sounds like a perspective thing as a child when you were in juvenile hall. And then when you went over to Men's Central, it changes how you think about things because the environment is so different. And then obviously shortly thereafter, you are met with a conviction and stuff. So,
but I will say this, and thank you for saying this because you're right. I think that the juvenile hall setting, there's a lot of unknowns. So no one's been in prison. No one has been, those life experiences, those harsh experiences are pretty minimal. I mean, you're confined, but you haven't been there.
Yeah.
Versus on the other side, there's men who have been in prison multiple times. They're hardened. The optimism is gone. The negativity is definitely alive and well. And so there's that stuff kind of breeds it rubs off, and you hear about it and you almost like lose hope.
Yeah.
So as much as I was trying to be optimistic on the adult side, the rude awakening from them who had been through it was like, buddy, like, hold on tight.
Yeah. Get ready.
Yeah.
Here we come.
Yeah.
Wow.
What do you think? This is a really big question, so you don't have to go too in detail, but you've been through it. What do you think about youth incarceration? Is it actually effective does it help the kids at all or?
I don't think it does.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it does. There's, there's some alternatives at this point.
Yeah. I
will say that maybe the initial arrest phase, like you've been arrested, there's an outcome, something has been determined about what's going to happen next. Like maybe that part should play itself out, but to hold the body longer than you need to doesn't yield the outcome you're expecting.
Right.
There's a lot of folks who are doing great work that is outside of a confined setting that can be very helpful.
Yeah.
A lot of children, a lot of youth, it's only compounded. So for example, there's a lot of youth who are in custody now who have learning disabilities.
Right.
And you put them in a setting where in some cases education is lacking. There's shame involved with not being able to read, to write. And that natural defense might be outburst or being violent or being, maybe a defense mechanism in many cases. So I hear stories now as a commissioner that there are some youths who are sort of not either classified or been determined to have learning disabilities. And they go to school and the teacher calls them out to, read or do something on the board or something. And because they're too embarrassed to admit that they can't read.
Yeah.
They sort of have an outburst.
Right.
And then that outburst triggers maybe a longer sentence or misbehavior. And so there's like these like silent triggers that, folks sometimes just don't think about.
Yeah.
And so does that child need to be confined?
Right. And our systems are maybe not set up to be seeking out the root cause of certain behaviors and addressing it there.
Exactly.
So obviously you're arrested when you're 16. And from that point on, you are incarcerated. So you really experienced your coming of age, turning from a boy into a man in an incarcerated setting. And I'm just so curious as to how you feel that incarceration during that time affected your development, maybe emotionally, mentally, whatever.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, it goes without saying that coming of age in a very hostile environment is not healthy.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll answer it this way. So when I came home, I noticed that I was responding differently than most people. And the impact that experience had on me while it was happening, maybe I didn't see the things that were being either developed within me or barriers or how my development had been impacted. But one that I noticed right away was that, so I was in relationships, someone early on who I was dating. Something that had happened. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I didn't respond appropriately.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, oh shoot, I'm responding like I was in prison, which is, if you see something happen, like, keep walking. Don't acknowledge it, because if you acknowledge it, then the guards will notice you, or that was none of your business or whatever, right? So you almost create this like barrier that on the outside doesn't work to your advantage.
Yes.
And so I noticed it bothered me, obviously, and I worked on it right away. And I think that was one example of how the experience had impacted me, and what lessons I had sort of brought home with me. What I thought were maybe a strength on the inside, on the outside, now they were like a barrier. They were like infringing on how I should have been interacting with people.
Right.
That makes me think so much about being a sibling to an incarcerated person, because I remember growing up, I think that there was a general lack of understanding, because none of us had ever been in prison before, of just how different the world was in there, and the code that you are all to live by to survive,
Mhm.
And I remember there being conversations along the way of like, why can't Ryan do things in this way?
Mhm.
And I think that there was such a gap in knowledge of really, he was living life in the way that he had to survive in the world that he was in. And for all of us, we wanted him to thrive in this world if he ever, when we expected him to come home.
And also just to be able to gel with us and how we were living.
100%. And so there was this expectation, and there was such a barrier of understanding between us and him. And now looking back in retrospect, I see it so clearly of, he was doing exactly what he needed to do to survive in the environment and the world that he was in. And we out here, we're living by a completely different code. You know what I mean? And it was all out of love and good intention of him coming here and being able to thrive and survive and excel in this world that he was supposed to come back out to. But it really did create conflict, in moments. And I remember that
came out of love, but I also think that things like that come out of fear when you're concerned that, your loved one is so impacted by their experience that it might change them permanently in ways that are harmful to them and their well-being and stuff. And you not wanting that to happen, the response to that can get so almost even controlling of like, can you behave this way? Can you do this? Can you do that? Wanting to feel like you're trying to help someone and guide someone when really there's just a barrier to understanding of exactly what you said, how he was living and how he had to live to survive, and how I imagine, you would have too. And that actually kind of leads me to,
you got to tell us.
Yeah.
You got to tell us the transition from jail to state prison. What did that look like? What did that feel like? What was that experience?
Well, mine was there was a middle sort of dynamic here. So mine went from juvenile hall to men's central jail to the California Youth Authority,
right?
Then eventually to the men's side, to the adult side of prison. And when I eventually went to state prison from the California Youth Authority, which is youth from the age of 18 to 25.
Okay.
I think I was 23 when I got there. I was pretty much tired of being around kids of my age. And so I wanted to be with older men. I just thought like the older men would have all this wisdom, and they had all these
you
wise.
You are so optimistic and so positive.
I swear to God. I mean,
know.
It's such a funny thing.
It must have gotten you through. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
It was innately placed in you by your creator to get you through what life was about to hand you.
So my thinking was this. I was like, I need to get there because these guys might have some advice for me. I don't know what. I'm hanging out with guys who are 20 years old, 21. Like these guys are worried about like Doritos and what, they're watching TV, whatever, right? Like I need to be with like men who had suffered, who had some roadmap for me, had something, right? Something that's worth, me listening to and so on, right? And so what's so funny is that I get there and the moment that I was waiting for sort of played itself out. So there was this older dude. He looked the part, right? He had the mustache, he had the tattoos. He looked smart. He looked like this is the guy who's going to instill some wisdom on me, right? Kind of befriended him. We kind of walked around, whatever. And when he finally said something, he said, "What's for dinner?" And I'm like, do I know what's for dinner? And I go, no. He says, all right, like later I got to go, right? And it was just like, damn, this is not what I was expecting.
The depth was missing.
You went from Doritos to dinner talk, and you thought you were going to get you thought you were going to get put on game, and it was very much so not.
You know what? It's bizarre, but the guy actually helped me because I was thinking like modern day Socrates, a guy with some education, whatever, right? But even though that was a memory that I have that I'm talking about it now after all these years, it really reminded me because what I was thinking was that wisdom came with age. So I was, as a young boy, thinking if you're older, you're automatically just smart or you're wise because you've lived life, you've had some ups and downs, you have something to pass down, right? And the guy, not to knock him, but he reminded me that that wasn't true.
Yeah.
You can be 60 years old or 70 or whatever age, but that doesn't make you wise. It doesn't make you...
Yeah. What you do with your life experience.
You can be 21 and be whatever, right?
You went to state prison I feel like that was not a joke at that time. It was never a joke, but the 90s,
it was tough, yeah, it was tough.
Crazy.
I've never really talked about it this way, but I've always felt that I've had like this like guardian angel. And I've never really even said the word guardian angel when it comes to this story.
Yeah.
But I've always felt that wherever I found myself, I think fear definitely helped me. Like the natural emotion of being afraid really kept me very vigilant. And, I'm not embarrassed, to say, I was afraid because, you should be afraid.
Yeah. Everyone is, whether they admit it or not.
Exactly. So here I am admitting it that I was afraid to be there as I should be. But I think that fear for me was a healthy fear.
Yeah.
And for me, fear was keeping me on my P's and Q's, was having me look around, was not allowing me to get relaxed. Looking back, it was very helpful to be able to be aware of that.
Right.
Because I think a lot of young men, if they notice that they're being afraid, they might want to sort of double down on being tough. Overcompensate. And then that's where things get worse, right? Yeah.
So I want to constantly be looping back in the fact that you're innocent. And I can imagine that spending so much time in prison, knowing that you're there for something you didn't do, must be a really complicated experience that you're having mentally and emotionally. And I wonder what your approach was to being innocent in prison. Like, did you talk about it very much? Did you share it? And also, like, just generally, what was your mental talk and self-talk like, knowing that you were in prison for something that you didn't do? And I'm sure you faced lots of skepticism and stuff for your story.
Well, early on, I think what was the deciding factor that maybe changed sort of what was going to happen next was that I still believed that this was going to be corrected. The same sort of thinking that I had in court of this is just a mistake, they'll figure it out. Even after that system let me down, I still believed in it. So this dynamic of like being wrongfully confined is you're now being punished, and your punisher is the person who holds the key to your freedom. So I knew as a very young age, if this was ever going to be corrected, it would have to be back in front of a judge, and there was no way around that. So talk about like the psychological pressures of wanting to hate what just happened, and on the flip side, having to almost like excuse it in order to kind of just say, I want to hate you for what you did to me, but I can't because I'll just make you...
I need you.
I need you. Exactly.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
I need you.
I've never really heard anyone explain it like that before.
Did you speak of your innocence to your peers when you were incarcerated?
I did. So I remember early on, I got some advice from someone to just make some noise. And making noise at that time meant either phone calls or writing letters. And this is kind of early on, maybe a year and a half into my incarceration, where I think the shock and awe of what had happened was still lingering. The effects of hearing the words life in prison or you're guilty.
Were you LWOP?
No, I had 30 years to life plus 5 consecutive life sentences. So, not officially, but unofficially.
Basically.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was that this thing about making some noise became like my mantra. And it would have been great if I had some like education under my belt. So making noise for me was like writing letters. So now here's this boy who was in 10th grade who was yanked out, formative years on just some basic grammar, spelling, sentence structure. You're now in this environment where like that's not kind of what's happening.
Right.
And so my initial letters to people were pretty bland, or maybe they weren't passionate enough, or maybe what I wanted to say really didn't get through or whatever, right? And that all came to be when I was forced to write the California Supreme Court to petition for my life. So I was assigned an appellate attorney who was doing my initial appeal. And this guy said, "Hey, Franky," or Mr. Carrillo, whatever he called me, "this is as far as I'm going to go. You've been denied in your appeal. My responsibility is up to this point. At this point now, if you want to continue, here's a 1-page cheat sheet of what you should do next. You're on your own. Goodbye. Good luck."
Wow.
And so I'm 18 years old, actually 19 years old, and I am in my cell crying, reading this letter. He sent me back my transcripts, and I had 30 days to get it together. I was basically a high school dropout or forced out of school because of this tragedy. I'm now in a position where I'm forced to communicate with the California Supreme Court and petition for myself.
Wow.
And so what I did was I borrowed a typewriter, I got some paper, I got a dictionary, and I put together a 1-page. It was supposed to be an appeal, like an appellate brief, but it was really a joke. I mean, I got their address in the right spot. I got a couple things based on what he told me to do. And then it was a very childish, short paragraph that basically said, "I've been wrongly convicted. I don't belong here. I need your help. Please come and rescue me," basically.
Oh my God, my heart breaks for you.
What's unfortunate is that I really believe that they were going to like hear my pleas for justice. And I sent that letter off. And about a month later, I get called to the office saying I had legal mail. And so I can see the envelope in the staff's office. And I'm like super eager to get back to my room and read it. And so they give it to me. I get back to my room and I open it up. And before I can even like read what they were actually telling me, I can see the big red stamp that said like rejected or whatever, right?
Oh my gosh.
And I'm just like, what the fuck, man? You know?
Yeah.
And so here we go, right? I've always been very sensitive, so I'm crying again, right? And so I'm just like, what the fuck is going on, man? And they sent me back what I had sent them. So my little chicken shit, petition, they returned it to me. And after I kind of settled down, I read it back to myself. I looked at it. And I was like so disappointed with myself. Like I misspelled my name. Like every other word was like misspelled. I never used a typewriter. You know, this is like manual, bing, bing, bing. Like
Yes.
I'm like, what the who the hell? Whatever,
Yes.
right? And so, to my credit, so here's a turning point. To my credit, I realized that if I was ever going to communicate the truth of what had happened and that I needed help, I had to go to school.
Yep.
I had to,
Wow.
because that letter was like the motivating factor that this is about a guy who's in the deep well who needs to communicate with the outside world. And if your only two options is collect calls, which more than likely they're not going to pick up, and your other option is writing letters, I better get with the program.
Wow.
And so I went to school and so on. So as you can imagine, my letters improved as time went on, but it took 15 years. It took 15 years of believing that I would write the perfect letter that would convince someone that there was an innocent now man.
I'm seriously tearing up.
Yeah.
I cannot believe like your optimism is pretty remarkable. For 15 years for you to maintain your belief that you would meet justice and that someone somewhere would help you. Did you ever struggle with your faith that it would go your way? Like, did you ever think to yourself, maybe you wouldn't be exonerated, maybe this wouldn't work out, or was this just your way at all times?
No, I struggled.
He's human, y'all.
Yeah.
He is not a machine. It was just discovered.
Exactly.
Because
this
you
is the
damn near
moment.
sound like you are an
I
optimistic
know.
machine. I'm
No.
like,
You know what? It's
seriously,
no, thank you. But I think the term that best helps me understand and explain what happened is you have to suspend reality. You have to suspend the fact that you are a prisoner who's been sentenced to live out the remainder of your life behind bars. You have to suspend the fact that you don't have a family who can hire an attorney or an investigator to come to your aid. You have to suspend the fact that you're no longer that little pretty boy. You're now coming of age, and those who remembered you are no longer thinking about you.
Mm.
You have to suspend the fact that as time goes on, the system, those who might remember you and believe in you are fading away. And not only is it painful, but you're in an environment where you hear people talk about suicide.
Mm-hmm.
You hear people talk about that sort of being an option. And I'll tell you that I thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
I never acted on it, but it crossed my mind. But the pressures of being confined, wrongfully or not, are so extreme
Yes.
that when you're in a situation like the one that I was in, you have to believe that there's good people out there who will eventually hear my cries and come to my aid. Like
Yeah.
that's all I had.
Yeah.
That's all I had. And as much as I would write Oprah Winfrey and I would write 48 Hours or 60 Minutes, there were some folks who would write back and say, I'm sorry to hear what you're going through, but we can't help you.
Mm.
But the majority would not write back.
Right.
You know, I would say that when I would hear back from people, I would be, again, enthused and like, can't wait to open the envelope and, hear something positive. There was just nothing that came of it.
Right.
And so lo and behold, I was in Folsom Prison and I was working for a woman by the name of Tony Carter, who was a GED instructor. And I was her teacher's aide. And she was about to retire. And so she announces to me on that Monday, Franky, just a heads up, like Friday's my last day. 20 years later, I'm about to retire. You might want to start looking for a new job. And by this point, I had been working her for years. So she knew my plight. She knew my story. She knew, who I was. That night, I went to bed like with a heavy heart that this woman who I'd been working for was about to now leave.
Mm.
It kind of saddens you. Like she's your boss, and you develop a working relationship with this person. And I woke up with this like profound dream, but I couldn't think. I can remember there was no vision. There was no nothing to play back. Right? It was just like I know there was a dream, but what I'm trying to remember what it was, and all I can think about was a message. Ask Tony to help you.
Wow.
Whoa.
That's it. Ask her or ask Tony to help you. And for a now man who had been writing letters and never really asking for help face to face, asking someone face to face was really hard.
Oh my gosh.
And so sure enough, Friday shows up, and as she's leaving the prison, she's like leaving the school area. I just call her and say, Tony, and she's like turns around and like, yeah, like, and I just flat out just said, Tony, you know what I've been going through. You know my story. You know that I'm innocent. Would you do me a favor? And she's like, yeah. I said, when you're out and about living your retired life, being a retiree, if you come across a reporter or a teacher, a lawyer, anyone you think can help me, would you just share my story?
Oh, I got the chills.
And she's like, I can do that. Yeah, I got you. And I felt so like I knew it was special. I knew that what I had asked was going to yield something.
Yeah.
What? I didn't know, right? But it felt good. It felt like I listened to the dream.
Yeah.
The message had
gotten
gotten
like you
through.
Like you were in alignment kind of intuitively.
100%.
Yeah.
And so as the story goes, about 6 months after that conversation with Tony, she was invited to a presentation. An author was in town, Bo Lozoff, who had written a book about prison. And it turns out that the person who was hosting the event was my Tai Chi instructor, Judy, who was there at Folsom as a volunteer. And so all this was going on with that, I'm in Folsom, but this was going on in the real world. And so Tony shows up to this event. As she tells her story, she wasn't even like, you know what, I've been there, done that. I read the book, but she showed up. And during the Q&A, a woman who was there announced that she was a lawyer. And so Tony's like, oh, lawyer, like this is the moment. Walks over, introduces herself, says, I'm a retired Folsom teacher. There's a person, Franky Carrillo, who I believe is innocent. Can I share his story with you? And Ellen Eggers, the attorney, agreed. And about a week later, she was at the prison visiting me, and it went from there.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
My whole body is one big chill. And I think I've heard this story
Wow.
before, but it's hitting different.
Yeah. And so like this encounter happens
Yeah.
that like changed my life.
So Ellen, you said her name was Ellen Akers.
Ellen Akers.
Ellen
yeah.
Akers, was she an Innocence Project lawyer? How did she connect you with the Innocence Project? Because that's who you ended up working with, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So she was a public defender.
Okay.
And so she got special permission from her boss to work on my case like on the weekends and her time off.
Wow.
So Ellen was able to contact the Innocence Project at the Santa Clara University in Northern California.
Okay.
And so they got involved. And then Morrison and Forster, like an international law firm, got involved as well. And so now like the people that I've been like yearning for all these years showed up.
Wow.
Like,
How did
I hate
it
to say it.
feel?
I mean, I hate to say it like so easy, like, oh, they just showed up, right?
No. It's a fucking God shot. Like
Yeah.
the thing about prison that we've talked about is that they specifically put them in out of sight places.
Mm-hmm.
They are warehousing humans out of sight of society. You know what I mean? And to find someone to have that experience, you were a needle in a haystack in a million different ways. And that was whatever angel you speak of that you feel like was guiding you. That is who was orchestrating that moment, you know?
No, I'm with you.
Whether you're a spiritual person or not, obviously you said that about your own life, but
Right.
so many things have to happen in perfect form for
I
that
agree.
experience to line up how it did.
And I
Oh my
will say,
God.
I kind of want to say that as much as it shakes me, your story, it saddens me that it has to be such an extreme alignment for
Yeah.
somebody to meet their justice, or for anybody to choose to, pursue defending you and helping you get out of the situation that you're in. Like, you shouldn't have spent 15 years up until that point writing a million letters and, pleading your case the way that you did. And now I just wanted to reflect on like how gorgeous that is for you that you met that moment, but also that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be so challenging for people to have access to the resources that they need to have such an egregious wrong righted,
You're absolutely right. I mean, we're using some terms here that are like sort of like religious, the next one is like, I feel like I'm a benefactor of a miracle or alignment. But I think in my case, to your point, like there had to be something that falls into the category of a miracle that happened for me to get justice.
Yeah.
And you're right. That is so unfair that the stars had to align or the alignment or the miracle has to happen.
We talk a little woo-woo on this podcast.
No, but we
Anyone
should.
who's coming here knows to expect that kind of. So we can you say what you need to say because
but I think it's language that there's a lot of mystery here. There's a lot of mystery how these things all play out.
Yeah.
Not only was I writing letters for 15 years, I was also preparing myself on a daily basis for if and when they ever came, that I would be ready. I mean, it was a surprise. I wasn't expecting her to, arrive that day, but I felt that I was not only prepared as a human being, but I was prepared to also talk about what had happened. And I guess looking back now, I had been preparing myself to remind her that I was human, that I needed to be helped. And, to my credit, or maybe to her credit, but when she left that visiting room that day, she says, Franky, I just met you. I'm going to do everything I can to get you out. I don't know all the facts of your case yet, but I believe in you.
Yeah. So walk us through from that point. You can spark notes it however you want to walk us through, but just where did the case move from that point through exoneration?
And also, how long did it take?
Yeah.
It had been 15 years up until that point. So how long?
So for the next 5 years, it was in their hands. So the case was really about turning over every stone that hadn't been even looked at. It was tracking down these boys who are now men. It was coming to grips with the fact that we had a case here that law enforcement had not only made a mockery of, but that were involved in some mishap here, right? It was unclear at the moment. And at the very core of this, there was a family who believed that the murderer was paying his debt to society.
Right.
So that was sort of like number one, going back to the victim's family and basically letting them know that what you believe is not the truth.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so The case was about untangling the lie.
Mm-hmm.
And the lie was that the cops had told these boys to lie against me.
Yeah.
And so it took 5 years to track everybody down. It took 5 years to basically prove my innocence. And so
your team ended up basically through their own investigation uncovering that there was evidence planted by the police and the detectives of trying to get these people to falsely identify you, correct?
correct.
Okay. And those witnesses, they ended up coming out and saying that they had lied, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So the recantation, that's like the fancy word. So
Yeah.
you recant, right?
Yeah.
And so you're basically putting yourself in jeopardy for potentially being prosecuted, right? For
Right.
perjury.
Yeah.
And at this point now, because the victim's son was a key witness, it's not your typical case, right? So it's one thing where you're just a witness, sort of innocent bystander. Maybe you don't know the victim. Maybe you don't know the folks who were harmed. But in this case, one of the men who had to come forward and confess that he lied was the son of the man who was murdered.
Wow. That's really deep.
So deep.
Yeah.
So deep. But it also gave credence and merit to his testimony.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Talk about the victim's family. If they really believed that what had happened and how it had ended was the truth, he would have said, "Thank you, but no thank you. I have nothing to say."
Of
Right.
course. My dad
know?
was killed. I don't want to participate in anything that I don't believe in, especially if it means the person that I, am saying did it
Yeah.
is given a hall
Yeah.
pass.
There's also other elements here that I was not expecting. So, to my attorney's credit, they realized that this is not an adversarial case anymore. This is now a case that the DA's office should be very concerned about
Right.
and should be on their radar. And so, through a great man, Scott Wood, who knew one of the DAs, a top DA, they arranged the meeting. The evidence of my innocence was presented to the DA's office, which is kind of unheard of then. Maybe now it's different, but back then, Bill Hodgman is the attorney I'm referring to. He happened to be the expert in eyewitness testimony. So it was like the perfect person to hear the case. And he believed that there was something here that had gone wrong. And to my surprise, the DA's office agreed to do like a mutual joint petition. So my attorneys had investigated the case. They decided they were going to investigate the case as well to make sure that what was being presented was legit, which makes perfect sense.
Of course.
And they agreed to just say, like, look, let's just file a joint petition to the court saying Franky's legal team and the DA's office agrees that Franky should be released right now. He's wrongfully convicted.
Mm.
And somebody within the DA's office said, I agree, but has the arresting agency been notified?
Mm.
And I guess someone checked and they said, okay, they haven't. Well, notify them that we're about to release this guy or file this petition. And so when they do, the sheriff's department says, don't release him.
Of course.
Don't release him. We believe he is guilty. We investigated this case. Like, don't do that. And so now the investigators are telling the attorneys what to do, which is not the way it's supposed to happen. So the case became very politicized. So now the DA's office and the sheriff's department are having all these, meetings of the mind, from the DA to the sheriff. At the time was Lee Baca. And it turns out that my case involved members of the sheriff's department that were these neo-Nazi or deputy gang members who had been not fired 30 years prior or 20 years prior. They had been promoted.
Wow.
And so, for example, the number 2 guy of the sheriff's department, Paul Tanaka, who has been in prison, since.
I was about to say, Lee Baca got out of federal prison like last year.
Exactly. But so number 2, Paul Tanaka, who was like the undersheriff, when I was arrested, he was the sergeant in charge of the arrest team.
Yeah.
So he was at the core of all this drama in that Linwood sheriff station. And so you can imagine why they were saying, like, let's just don't make this go away. Come on, you know?
Yes.
And so long story longer, we go to court and it all kind of unfolded there. But it's unfortunate that even when the sheriff's department were introduced with evidence that they had made a mistake, they were not willing to accept it. And they would
Yes.
rather have me spend the rest of my life in prison
Yes.
than allow the evidence to speak for itself and for me to get my life back.
Right.
And that's unfortunate.
So fucking unfortunate.
That's so fucked up.
It
It's
really
all too
is.
common as well, which makes it even worse. But I want to get back to you and your journey. And so this took 5 years.
It did.
And finally, you get the word and you're able to go home. And being released is probably one of the most insane life experiences in and of itself, let alone your incarceration, all of that. And I want to know what it was like for you. I think it's different for everybody. But what was it like being released? Did you have any fears? What were the beautiful parts? What were the challenging parts? Get into it.
No, it's so I heard the judge say the words that I've been wanting to hear, which seems like my entire life. Like
How long
you're
at that
free
point?
to go.
20 years.
20 years, yeah. A little bit over 20 years. And there was this inner voice that just said like, about fucking time.
Yes.
Like
as it should.
It's luckily for me, it was being televised. So the cameras were in the room, in the courtroom.
Yeah, I've seen that footage.
Yeah.
I think on the Innocence Files I saw it or something like that.
Yeah. So that footage was captured. That moment was captured in time.
Wow.
And my return takes us back to, hell on earth. So I was at the Men's Central Jail, brought down from Folsom to await my final hearing, my final trial. And I was basically in the sheriff's dungeon. It was like their stronghold, their castle. And so I'm back in that space, right? And as I was leaving my cell, they wanted to make sure they just dogged me one more time. And they walked me they had me in high power, and they walked me down to the release area. And there was 2 deputies who said, okay, he doesn't have any clothes. And the dude gives me this stupid jacket, man. I'm just like, it's been 20 years, but I'm not gonna put that shit on, man. Like, fuck that. And it was like something like Elvis Presley would wear or some shit, right? And I'm just like, nah, dude, hell nah. And he's like, well, if you want to get out, you have to put it on. I'm like,
this
no.
shit's about to be televised. You need to put me on something fresh. Don't put me in this ugly shit.
It was so fucked up. I mean, I swear to God, I was just like, they weren't laughing. They were just like mocking me, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, nah, I'm not going to do that, man. I'm like, is there anything else? And so eventually they like cave, right? And they gave me this like super big like polo shirt and some jeans and shit, right? But I'm like, it beats what they were initially going to give me. Like, hell no, right? So they walked me to this door, and it was a beautiful day. And from the door opens, and the first thing I see was like beautiful weather, trees, and like 30 people running towards me.
Wow.
Majority were people with cameras and microphones, right?
Oh.
And then my lawyers came, and it was like a TMZ moment, like right there, like my first moment as a free man. What do you, no, it's just like, Franky, right? Whatever, right? So of all the questions, I remember someone asking me, Mr. Carrillo, at what level of anger do you exist in right now? Like, tell us about the anger in your heart after all you've gone through, right? And I guess to my surprise, even thinking about it now, like I remember answering that question with like, I'm no longer angry. Like, those who are watching this, you should be angered over what happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let me be free. Let me live my life.
Wow.
And
I just wish you were in the Elvis Presley jacket, because now I'm going to go find the footage and I'm going to be so fucking bummed when I see this big polo and it's not an Elvis Presley jacket. We're going to pull the footage up and put it in here.
Exactly right. No, exactly. But I think actually the second thing I remember, because I've watched it before, the cameras captured me just like looking up and just like, wow, like I'm free.
Yeah.
I've never been good at, determining temperature, 74 degrees, whatever, but it was like a perfect day.
74 degrees is actually the perfect temperature. I've
Is
determined
it?
this. 73, 74 with the light breeze.
You're not good at it, but she is.
No, I'm serious. Okay, I've taken stock of this. That's genuinely the perfect temperature with a light breeze and low humidity, okay?
So
it probably was 74
It probably
degrees.
was 74 degrees, yeah. And, there was people there hadn't seen in 20 years, some family members. My attorneys were there, obviously. I knew that as much as I wanted this to be the end, it was really just the beginning. And I've been home for 13 years now. My life has been a blessing every single day. But I'll tell you that the transition wasn't easy. As much as I made it look easy, as much as I used those tools that I had developed on the inside to sort of help me keep it together on the outside. There was many times where I just couldn't do it. It was a lot.
Wow.
And one example of that was the day after my release. So I was another gathering, more people, big luncheon somewhere. And I remember waiter came by and he, waters and whatever else. And the menus were passed out. And I was looking at the menu and I was just overwhelmed. Like it was like if it was written in a foreign language. I just could not understand what the hell this was.
Wow.
I had never maybe held a menu like that in my entire life. I was even thinking like, damn, what do I want to eat? It was like the first time that I had to make a decision about food. It was like, who cares, right? Food, right?
No.
And I cheated. So the woman who was to my right, I was the first guy to order. So she was the last woman. I was the first man. And so then I said, oh, I'll have what she's having, right? Like just to kind of get out of that weird dynamic, right? Might have been like a tuna sandwich. Who knows what the hell it was. But I was just like, get this moment over with, right?
Yeah.
And that night I cried myself to sleep because I'm like, fuck, man. I've been yearning to get out. I'm out and I can't even order food. It just was this like very stupid moment that I overcomplicated for myself. And so it might be simplistic, it might be simple, but even something as simple as ordering food had become a challenge, which is so bizarre.
I don't think it's simplistic at all. I feel like that really speaks to how layered the impact of incarceration is on an individual. I think we focus so much on the really large obstacles that people face when they're released. Like, how are you going to find a job? How are you going to find housing, depending on the levels of support you have? Those things that are so make it or break it in life. But it's really on every level, your familiarity with choice and with everyday small decision making when so much of your experience has been forced on you or told to you what you can and will be doing at any given moment. And I can just imagine the overwhelm of the amount of decisions that you're then all of a sudden out of nowhere having to make for yourself at any given moment. And on the one hand, you're so grateful for them because you're like, I've dreamed of this day where I get to decide for myself at any given moment what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say, all of these things. And at the same time, the task of actually doing it, I can imagine would be scary in ways, exhausting in ways, overwhelming, all of that. So I do feel like it's just really important to acknowledge that like these are the things that people are going through when they're released and into such a different world than the one that they were just living in, and also into a totally different world than the one that they originally were taken from when they were incarcerated. I imagine that you probably face that a lot. You're arrested or sentenced, I guess, in 1992, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're released in 2011. Totally different world you're coming out to as well. Technology and everything. So I can imagine that in and of itself would have been a wild experience for you too.
And, it would be unfair for me not to mention this. So before the judge actually said, you're free to go, he said, where are you going to live? And I looked around like, I don't know, like no one had thought about like, where was I going to live? I was just released after this horrific experience. I've been the boy, now man, clamoring, I want to go home, I want to go home. Mm-hmm. And there was no home to go to. Mm-hmm. My father had passed away, who was my caregiver. Mm-hmm. And my siblings had moved on with their lives. And there was nothing lined up for me. So another miracle, another thing aligning, another star falling into place. One of my attorneys who was in the courtroom, Scott Wood, said, he can come live with me and my wife. And I guess for that moment of confusion, I guess I was homeless, I suppose, or unsure what was going to happen next. And so to your point, you're right. I was able to have someone intervene who was a private citizen who decided to take on a responsibility of ushering someone into a new world.
Right.
And that can be, to his credit, he didn't know.
Yeah.
Whatever psychological outburst or fears or all the concerns that maybe folks can have of the unknown.
Yeah.
The unknown was right there for all of us. But to his credit and my benefit, they believed in me.
Wow.
And I was able to be in a place where the love that I needed, the space, the understanding of someone seeing a 37-year-old man sort of walk for the first time, which I hope for them was a blessing to just sort of experience that.
Oh, I'm absolutely positive it was.
And the reality right now is that I went from a boy who was trashed, literally. The prison system that we have in the US here in California is a machine.
Yeah.
And it can only run with human bodies.
Yeah.
People work there. If there was no bodies there, then there's no job. So that's very simplistic to think about it that way. But I would view myself that I was trashed as a human being. I was in this pile of humans that society deemed, for whatever reason, were not worthy of being free.
Right.
And to return from that world and to find some inner purpose and to see my life really feel very privileged.
And with that said, I'm so curious about exonerations and how the state responds to such an egregious wrong that they've committed.
Yeah.
Like, what is the process? You were exonerated in the state of California.
Correct.
Were you exonerated in that moment that the judge said you're free to go, or did you have to litigate further your exoneration? Because I know that it's sometimes that you're free under circumstances, but that it's not that the case has overturned, or the state has overturned your case,
So, great question. So I was ordered to come back to court 2 weeks after the big moment. So the judge that was captured on film, you're free to go. But come back in 2 weeks. So the 2-week dynamic there was the DA has an opportunity or decision to make, basically, if they want to retry you.
Yeah.
If they have more evidence, they have whatever moves them to say, we're going to give this one more shot, they have a card to play. And so I came back to court and they decided that this case was over. But there's some other parts about fact finding. So the judge then makes a finding of facts as to why he determined that this case should be overturned. And then that document becomes the vehicle to get you compensated or not.
Okay.
You would apply for compensation on a state level. If they deemed that you were wrongfully convicted, they would award you $100 per day for every day that you were confined. You would assume that if you were freed under the pretense that you were wrongfully convicted, that process would be very easy. But it's not. You're in front of the Victims' Compensation Board. So now you're a victim. You've been victimized by the system.
Absolutely.
And they want to make it right. But they're still a fact finder. So it's like another board, another mini trial. And they determine if you're not only worthy of the money, but do you qualify for it? So the Attorney General gets involved, and either they determine that you are worthy or not. And so in my case, they thought I was worthy, so they gave me the money. But other cases, even if the individual has been proven to be innocent, that specific board says, well, it's not so clear to us.
Okay.
And so then it's another drama, right?
Yeah.
So in my case, so back to me. So they
Back to me.
exactly. So so I was awarded the money, right? So
Okay.
it was maybe about 2 years into it. But the bigger lesson here, I think, for all of society, is that when it's been determined that agents of the state, so the government, the sheriff's department, are at fault, because we live in a country where suing people is kind of what you do to sort of prove a malice act or whatever. But there's many reasons why people sue. But in my case, I sued because it was clear that I had been wronged.
Yeah.
And it was a federal lawsuit. We end up settling the case. And what's tragic, even though I was awarded a large amount of money, what's tragic is that the person who was at the center of this, Craig Ditch, the deputy, he retired unscathed. The money that was eventually paid to me was taxpayers' money.
I was just about to say.
And it's just unfortunate that I feel the message is that you can behave like Deputy Ditch and nothing's going to happen to you.
Yes. We talked about this in our brother's case, where the lack of accountability and the lack of consequences, it makes people not even have to think twice about their behavior because they're not concerned about what the outcome will be for them.
Exactly.
And sometimes the outcomes are positive, with convictions and with being involved in a conviction. Sometimes it can lead to a promotion. It can lead to positive outcomes for these people. And so you can infer that there might even be sometimes an incentive just to get that conviction and maybe not to do it the right way, or maybe to look the other way if you have any inkling that it's not being done the right way. And so you're right. I'm really glad that you brought that up because it needs to be talked about. People need to understand that this is what's happening, and they need to understand that it's another obstacle to justice overall, that people are not worried about what's going to happen to them if they are part of law enforcement or sometimes a part of the DA's office and they act not in accordance with what you would hope the values would be.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, because I think it would have been so understandable having gone through this whole experience if you would have wanted to just have a little peace and quiet and just move on with your life. But you have
Run for
chosen
the hills.
again and again to re-engage. You've re-engaged with the incarcerated community. You've re-engaged with the Los Angeles community in wanting to represent us politically and all of that. And where does that motivation come from to want to kind of go back into the belly of the beast a little bit and continue to expose yourself to all that's going on?
That's a great question. I think the best way for me to frame that or respond to that is that, not only was I coming of age in a very hostile environment, not only was I believing in a system that had let me down, and not only was I dreaming big dreams in a place where nightmares is what's common, I was really becoming an advocate. And that switch of, am I an advocate today or not, had just broken and was like stuck on that this is just who I am.
Yeah.
Not only was I advocating for myself, for my future, but amongst those who were around me, I was advocating for on the inside. And I knew the importance of being that boy whose voice was taken away to now being in a world where I know the importance of using your voice to help others.
Mm-hmm.
And what has happened since I've been home, my way of being of service is showing up. So Tony Carter showed me that if you show up, then the unknown the stars will align, right? Whatever is intended for you will find you there. And in the last 13 years, it felt like from day one, a lot of attention has been thrusted on me or responsibilities have been put on my shoulders that I willingly want to carry. I know that it's different when an exoneree talks about incarceration versus maybe someone who maybe harmed someone. Although it for me, it rings equally the same.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes the listener maybe can hear it differently when someone who was unjustly there for whatever reason. But I think that I'm obviously not the only one doing this work.
Yeah.
But I think to empower other people to also know that you're free, you're able to now do whatever you want to do in the world. And how you want to be in that world is yet to be determined. And if you choose to stay, not forget where you came from, which is an interesting term there is purpose there. And I have found purpose in being of service, not only to the community of those who have been either wrongfully convicted or just confined overall. I think that's the better place where I find myself now. But I think there's also a lot of overlap. I think about the school to prison pipeline. And I think about that term and I was a high school student. So when I think about school to prison pipeline, that sounds a little familiar to me. How do we think about that? How will I ever forget, which I'll never will, being a teacher's aide to grown men, majority of the men that were there were from Los Angeles, who were now in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who had trouble reading and writing.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation here with education and where they ended up? I mean, there's so many internal things that all just have come back together for me. But you're right. I think someone who has been granted justly award, one would assume what big island can I live in?
Enjoy this.
Hammock, coconuts, what I don't know, whatever, right? I mean, whatever you're envisioning, right? Like, let me just live it up. But instead, I decided to stay. And I'll tell you this: if I thought that things had changed, that the system had corrected itself, that law enforcement, other agencies, other departments saw the ways of their errors and understood that this is harming people, I might have had a different approach to my life and figured, okay, you know what? They don't need me. My story doesn't sort of mesh anymore. I'll move on, right? But I think the advocate in me is definitely alive and well, and I'm happy for that.
Yeah, the need is definitely there. We need you.
Well, this is a quick side note, but
Yeah.
it reminded me because we met Franky at the Compton Innocence Initiative event.
Mm-hmm.
And I distinctly remember you making a comment, I was really tired today. And I didn't really know if I should come here today because I had a really long day. But I'm so glad that I showed up because this has been such an important moment for me. Whatever, experience you were having inside of you of listening to Carly speak about our brother and all of the other family members. And it's just not that this is nothing like Tony Carter, you know what I mean? But it just really is a reminder of you never know who you'll meet, what connections you'll make, what can ever come of that from extending yourself and really, showing up. So definitely a lesson to me too.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. Like, you never know. I mean, I think about these subtle moments in our lives, or the mystery of life, right? Where those moments where I think about Tony, if Tony wouldn't have, she was on her way to San Francisco and she was like, you know what? Let me just go. Whatever drew her there, I'm grateful.
Sheesh.
Because if she would have not shown up, then she would have never met Ellen Eggers, and then Ellen Eggers would have never heard of me, and then life would have moved on, right?
Yeah.
And it's just something that might be of no value, no grand storyline. It's just, she just showed up and did her part.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that I was raised as I guess by default, Mexican family. I would check the Catholic box as a boy, right?
Yeah.
But we wouldn't go to church. We weren't like a religious family. So I didn't really have church in me or religion in me when this happened to me. During my incarceration, towards the end of it, you learn other people's religions and you meet friends who are Christian or Muslim or whatever, right? But there was this older man from Minnesota who was in a California prison. And he had become like my advisor. He was like that old wise guy that I had always been looking for.
Yeah.
I'd finally found him.
Yeah.
The guy's name is Rich. It's just this old white dude. Dude never spoke to anybody but me. Like, it was just like he had been in prison for like 40 years.
Wow.
And tragic story, but the guy was like an amazing man. Sadly, he's still there. And he was my friend. And I would listen, he would talk, and, he was like my mentor, right? And one day I told Rich, Rich, I need a jolt, man. I feel like I'm losing some hope, even during my encounter with the lawyer. So they were already part of my life, but it was 5 years, right? Like maybe year 3 into their arrival. I'm like, I wish there was a story about an exoneree that would empower me, that would keep me going. And he said, there's actually a story in the Bible about just what you're looking for. And I'm like, the Bible, dude? Like, really? He's like, yeah, this is a story in the Bible. And I'm like, where? Like, I've never heard about this, exoneree in the Bible, whatever. And I thought he was messing with me, right? But it turns out he's like, go to Genesis, whatever. And so I went there and I found the story of this guy named Joseph. And from that point on, every few days I would read the story of Joseph. And if you guys don't know, I'll give you the synopsis of it. Joseph was one of many brothers. And the story goes that he was a good-looking boy. Like, I don't know why they said he was like very handsome, his father's favorite, and his brothers hated him. And eventually the brothers would toss him into a pit, tell the father that he had been killed, and basically do away with him. Lo and behold, someone found Joseph in that pit, put him into slavery. He was sold off, and he became basically a slave in Egypt. And while he was a slave, he was accused of raping someone or some sexual act, and he was imprisoned for almost 20 years. And while he was there, he was a dream interpreter. That was like the value he would bring to his friendships or to people there. And anyway, long story short, somebody who was in prison with him remembered him at some point and said, hey, there's a guy, Joseph, who's a dream interpreter. So they got him out of the prison and he became helpful on the outside. He eventually forgave his brothers. He eventually became a politician when he got out. And for me, there's this unusual place for me to find sort of like this roadmap of a guy who had been trashed. I say trashed, but in this case, he was discarded by his brothers, wrongfully confined, and then eventually became a public servant. And I think the element there for me that rings true is that he forgave. And the story here wouldn't be the story if that wasn't there. And so for me, the fact that I've been able to befriend the DA who prosecuted me, The DAs who later on prosecuted me as well. The witnesses who lied are now friends of mine.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. So Damien,
Franky.
yeah. You
Like
know,
you guys hang out?
yeah.
Wow, Franky. You're
The judge,
different.
yeah.
You built different for real.
So the judge who eventually freed me, we're friends. I'm gonna see him this Friday.
Franky.
Yeah.
That's a different level of
Holy
forgiveness.
shit.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even explain it, but I just feel like I not only do I forgive them for their role. I mean, I could hate them forever, right? The judge, the DAs, the witnesses. But that would be a different prison. That would be a space that I was trying to get out of for such a long time. And so, I mean, it's courageous, right? To be like, you know what, you harmed me, but I want to be your friend.
Because it's a different level. You can say, I forgive you, and yet I have no need for you in my life. You're forgiven, but goodbye.
Yeah.
But you're like, no, you're forgiven, and also
Yeah.
we can be at complete peace and coexist together with joy, honestly, that's just Franky.
Yeah, my role, I mean, I'm running for state assembly here. When I win, I would be one of 80 members. So California is broken down to like a big puzzle, and there's 80 members in the assembly. I would be one of 80. And I think I tell people, and it's true, I would be making history here. I would be the first person who had ever been confined in California to now be a lawmaker.
Yeah. So tell us some of your goals for what you want to do as an assemblyman.
Well, I think on a very sort of non-job related, I want to inspire people to really dream big.
Yes.
What has happened to me shouldn't be the end of the story. Shouldn't prevent me from being a legislator. The reason why I want to do this is sort of self-explanatory, right? All that I've gone through. But I think about that boy who believed in the system, who believed that all the laws that had been written up to that point were designed and written to protect me.
Yeah.
And instead, they all failed me.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
For someone to be wrongfully convicted, everything had to go wrong.
Yeah.
And to now go back to where these laws were written, to the source of possibly the problem, or in the way I like to think about the source of where you can fix things, makes me very happy.
Yeah.
Things about, wrongfully convicted folks obviously is really close to my heart, as you can imagine. But I think about why is it that nonprofits are fixing governmental problems?
Exactly. I could not agree more. I think about this constantly.
These are problems that are being created by government agencies.
Yes.
But they refuse to address them.
Yes.
So for me, it's like, do we create an office? Great things that are happening within DA's offices throughout the state, but we need more.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things about making sure that laws that are on the books now are being implemented.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that there's a lot of great laws that have been passed that folks maybe in certain law enforcement agencies refuse to implement.
Wow.
Because it makes their work, as they would say, it makes it harder to get a conviction. But that's not the point. That's not the point.
No.
I mentioned the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
I think about mainly young boys, girls obviously. I have a daughter who's 7. I think about her coming of age in Los Angeles. And I think about the mental health pressures or the pressures overall that can lead to, for my daughter and my son, their friends, all of the young kids who are going to be in that age bracket of maybe 14 to 18 who struggle so hard, and depending if they have the right resources to endure that transition into young adulthood, that worries me. It worries me, and there's people who are doing a great job of making sure that kids are productive, but sadly, a lot of kids are still not making it. So I'm always thinking about being in that room where those decisions are being made.
Yes.
And to remind people that we're talking about human beings here. And people shouldn't be trashed, shouldn't be discarded, shouldn't be exiled. But I think on a more personal note, I didn't think I would be like the green space guy. But I was just recently thinking of all the impacts that I've had from my incarceration, coming of age in a cement, non-dirt, non-greenery, non-tree world.
Yeah. You're speaking her language. I feel like you're about to say something that's going to make her super happy.
Well, it's interesting to be in a place where I was just yearning for my toes on some grass.
Yes.
when I would think of being free, I would think about the ocean. I would think about trees. I would think about why was I so enamored by just like staring at like landscapes in prison in my cell. I mean, it was a still image, obviously, right? Or a painting, but I couldn't get out of the fact that like, this is my medicine. Like there was like a calling that I needed to be around open space that maybe needed me more than I needed it, right?
Mhm.
And so I think about like what I would love to champion in a world that's being maybe overbuilt. You know, there's no green space anymore. Like there's parks, but like we have to protect those parks and make sure that people who maybe live in an apartment doesn't have any lawns or doesn't have any
Yes.
green space has somewhere to go and find refuge and just run them toes through that grass and just feel connected.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. I can't even imagine how
absolutely.
happy that made you feel when you finally got to do that.
Wow.
So you're running in the 52nd district.
I am.
How can people support you? How can they help?
So contributions are sort of forefront of my mind right now. So campaigns, as you can imagine, are ran by money to get your message out. It's kind of where it's at.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of phone calls. You know, I've gotten a lot of amazing endorsements. But I think it's volunteering. If you can contribute, that would be amazing. I would appreciate that. You can find me on my frankycarrillo.com.
We'll put all of his info.
Yeah.
And
so you
I
can
want to make
find him.
sure for our LA listeners, people understand who's in the 52nd district and kind of what cities that encompasses.
Who can vote for you?
Yeah. So if you're looking at an aerial view of Los Angeles, so I think Dodger Stadium is sort of like the heart of it.
Okay.
So I think about where I live in Echo Park.
Okay.
If you're moving west of that, it would be Silver Lake, a little bit of East Hollywood, Los Feliz. Moving upwards would be like Atwater Village,
Okay.
the southern part of Glendale, Eagle Rock, Highland Park, Lincoln Heights, East LA, where my parents came to when they came to the US. I was born in General Hospital, not too far from there. We're talking about Cypress Park, all these little pockets, but it's basically like the Northeast and East LA.
I feel like I've seen something on your Instagram, a map where it shows all of the cities. So I'm going to make sure that we incorporate that so that people can
like
see a
little
visual.
It's like Frogtown, like, unless you know the area, like, Frogtown.
Yeah.
But it's, if you go on my Instagram or you look it up on my website.
Okay, great.
The idea is that it's a district that is, I feel like it's made for me.
Yeah.
It's a very progressive district. It's a district where a lot of harm has happened. And to return to a district where, as a father, to be hopeful, to believe, as I've always believed, that there's, brighter days, I guess, ahead.
Yeah. God, and we need that in this world
It makes me so happy that I can be able to also break stigmas. I think a lot of times, like, what I'm doing is also being an ambassador for folks who have been confined. I think it's also sort of having that paradigm shift of folks who have been confined might be stereotyped to be hardened or insensitive or potentially reoffend or, whatever sad things folks are bombarded with about, where they've been and what they've done. And so I feel like a lot of people have been freed, have succeeded, have been great examples, have been champions. And so I'm just one of many in the community. Most folks who are running for public office, they want to lead with like, I'm a county commissioner. I'm a businessman. I'm an investor. I'm a parent. I lecture around the world. Whatever it's going to be like catchy.
Yeah.
I have chosen to lead with the part of my story that I don't want to forget about. And I want people to be aware of what happened and what happens.
Yes.
I want people to be aware that there is life after incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
I want people to know that the system that we all rely on, and maybe hope that if we're ever in a situation that we are relying on it, that it's fair and it's just, that system makes mistakes. And I want to be an example to my children at the end of the day, that here's your dad who has endured a horrific experience in his life. And after that, he had the courage to still stand up, give back, and make sure that doesn't happen again.
Fuck yeah.
Gorgeous.
That's my legacy.
I have one absolutely massive question to send you off with. So, after all this, everything you've been through, what do you think is something that stands out to you as something important that you've taken from your experience and that you live with, that you think about life, that you believe about yourself, or just something that you kind of took away?
Well, it's a great way of wrapping it up, right? Unless you have a question over there.
No.
But the lesson that I will never surrender, and it's one that maybe is what got me here, is that I was able to figure out how to be present in the moment. And as simplistic as that is, I think for me was one of the most profound lessons that I was able to tap into when my world was at a standstill.
Yeah.
I'll leave you this memory here. So I was, for the last 10 years of my incarceration, I was at Folsom Prison.
Mm-hmm.
And Folsom is a prison that was built in 1880. It's the second oldest prison in California. And it was the original death row.
Wow.
So that's where that was at. And while at Folsom, I was in 5 Block, which was the oldest cell block in that prison. And right next to it was Condemned Row, which was another part of the building that was sort of like off limits. And I knew that the latch wouldn't lock. I knew that I can disappear from this prison and go into the original death row of California, which was in Folsom. And so I remember leaving, sort of escaping from, where the cops can see me. And I would sneak into this huge iron door. I would open it. I would get in there. And when you're in this sort of mini prison block, there's like maybe 4 cells on the bottom and 4 cells on top, or maybe 8, total of 16 possibly. And then right there, you see the gallows, like the big piece of wood where they would have the rope.
Wow.
So all this is still happening today. And what I would do to escape the rat race of all the noise, all the people, I would escape deeper into the prison, and I would open one of those original death row cells that would just be a tomb, basically. And I would close the door, and I would sit there on the ground, and I would just meditate. And I'll tell you that in those 20 years, that was the freest that I had ever been, maybe in my life.
Whoa.
I had escaped from the prison into like a deeper prison, and I would lock myself into this cell, which would be pitch black, and I would just sit there on the floor and cry. And I would just feel so free and make a decision that sort of going deeper in wasn't bad. Maybe conscientiously as well, maybe metaphorically thinking about it. Like for me, that's where it was at for me. And so I found this bizarre like portal, which sounds weird, but
No, it sounds
spiritual is what it sounds like.
Right.
It sounds like you met your shadow self in that dark place and sat with that person and became friends.
Yeah.
That's what I gather from that.
Well, these stories of a world that many folks have enlightened me as well with their stories. And so I know the benefit of sharing these stories that no one would ever know if I would be here, if no one ever asked me, or I would just interject some random story, right?
Yeah.
But it's stories that also allow me to be free, to share them and to say like, look, maybe people are expecting riots or expecting some story about a shank or whatever. TV stuff, right?
Is that what the men ask you on their podcast?
Exactly,
They're like, what was the biggest riot you were in, bro?
Exactly.
Tell us what went down.
Exactly, right. No, but there's a gentleness, and I'm grateful you guys are doing this because it allows folks who are tender in a very tough environment, and who, as much as they don't want to maybe possibly admit for some, they had moments that really were defining and that they should embrace and talk about, because it's not only therapeutic, but it reminds them that at a terrible situation that they found themselves in, that even then there was moments of hope. There was moments of believing in themselves. Mm-hmm. There was moments where they said you shouldn't dream, but you still dreamt. There was moments where you believed that things would be better. And then lo and behold, here you are, right?
The picture you painted of going deeper is not a bad thing. I just feel like no matter what you've been through in life, that is such an important and beautiful sentiment to have about being a human being and walking through the fire and choosing to confront the challenge and the truth of the experience you're having. I think it's so tempting to want to avoid what's hurting you, and it's a survival mechanism of avoidance or of trying to get by with as little hurt or pain as possible. And you imagine to yourself what is going to cause you so much hurt and pain might be going deep into what scares you the most or what is the wound.
Yeah.
But really, like, going deeper into it can free you of it.
And you know what's interesting? We're now engulfed with social media, right? So there's a version of a social media on the inside. I was recently thinking about, so we're going back to Folsom here. There'll be times where the guy who was assigning cells, so if you're like a new arrival, wherever there was a single person in the cell, then he would say, okay, you go to room whatever. And so my cellie had left, and so I was single cell for like a few days maybe. And I asked the guy, hey, like, do me a favor, man. For the guys who are just kind of like a layover, they're just here for a day or two, let my cell be the cell where they come to. And he's like, are you sure? I go, yeah. People don't want to have the person who's going to be there for one night or 2 nights. Like, let me do that. He's like, all right. So he assigned me to be like the layover cell, right? I'm grateful that I did this. So there were these folks who were coming in on their way to Pelican Bay or other places. And they were like travelers, basically, is how I viewed it, I suppose. And so they would arrive and no judgment. I would make them a nice meal. I would hear the story of their travels. I would hear stories about, their lives. And I remember that I learned that what you did when you got a new roommate, 9 times out of 10, you would get your photo album, like an actual hard album with actual pictures in it, and you would give it to your roommate, and he would give you his. And as he's looking through your photo album, you're looking through his photo album, and you're saying, "Oh, that's my mom, or that's my sister, or that's my kids, whatever." Right? Oh, that's the car I used to have. That was like for me a moment of going on someone's social media page, their Instagram, and like looking at their stuff. And this was like a prison version of exchanging photo albums to almost allow the person you're interacting with to be humanized.
Yes.
Wow.
So you're saying basically, I belong to these people. Like this is an extension of, you might see me here in this cell with you, but this is where I come from. These are my people. And that's where they live, and that's the car they drive or whatever, right? Whatever might be captured in the photograph.
Yeah.
And for me, these tender moments of knowing the importance of allowing someone to decompress in front of you.
Yeah.
It's a tough journey of like being moved from one prison to another or transitioning even into a prison, and to be able to find somebody who is conscientiously aware that you need to be humanized during that process, for me was key. You almost have to create a welcoming environment to allow someone to open up.
Absolutely.
And so for me, like, hey, welcome, here's your bunk. What do you need? You need some soap, whatever. And I've never talked about that because I've always felt, I don't know why, I've never even brought that up, but I'm grateful that this trio here has allowed me to just remember these moments where that might not make the storyline about just being tender or kind to another human being.
That is the storyline.
Yeah.
That's what we're here to share. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like that is the fucking point.
Yeah.
That these warehouse human beings that we've strategically offset into corners of our country.
Yeah.
There's so much tenderness, so much kindness, so much warmth, so much goodness, so much potential, all of it. You know, that is what we're trying to say.
Yeah. And we're definitely saying it tonight. Yeah.
Definitely.
Who could we want more than Franky Carrillo?
Franky fucking Carrillo.
The California State Assemblyman for the 52nd District. If you don't vote for this man,
we'll send you to prison.
Oh my God.
This is
what an honor. What an honor.
Truly.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm the one who's honored. Thank you.
Legend. A legend amongst us.
Well, look, let me turn the tables on you guys. I'll say this, and this is kudos to both of you because you have, I don't know if you understand this or not, but you being in spaces where the tenderness and the light that you bring into a room where conversations are very heavy, and you bring the toughness, obviously, but you bring this joyous optimism. I think that we're talking about optimism here into people's lives that as an observer, seeing you guys just be you as a duo. I mean, I've always thought about you guys as like, when you see one, you see the other.
Pretty much.
It's an Ellen Eggers moment for me. What is this woman from Fort Wayne, Indiana doing visiting some guy in Folsom? It's like the person who you would expect to be maybe doing something else with their lives, but there you are, right? And I think the credit you guys deserve is one that I commend you for. I think you bring a I'll think of the word, but you bring something to the room and to the conversation that is long overdue.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't think it could be higher praise coming from a more, I don't know, wonderful source. That is...
whatever missions that we are on and whatever reasons that our paths have crossed, I'm just grateful.
Me too.
So thank you.
Same. Thank you.
You're amazing. Drop your mic, Franky, because
Franky fucking Carrillo, baby.
Woo!